Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre for Texts in the City. Today we'll be discussing Geraldine Brooks' Year of Wonders. My name's Jenny Niven. I'm the Programme Manager at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, and I'm joined today by Matthia Dempsey, who's Editor-in-Chief at the Bookseller magazine. So please join me in welcoming Matthia. Thank you. Can I just ask, folks, how many of you have read Year of Wonders? Great, excellent. So this is one of the few public events where we will ask you actually to make comments as well as ask questions. So we'll chat through for about half an hour or so, and then if you want to think up some really tough questions for Matthia, we'll take 10 minutes or so of them towards the end. Great. So, Matthia, shall we start? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your relationship with the book, when you came to read Year of Wonders and what you thought of it?
Sure. I was actually reading Camus' The Plague, which your teachers might have told you is another good book to read alongside this one. And I got the phone call from the Wheeler Centre to see if I wanted to do this event, and so I just sort of thought, oh, that's a nice coincidence. I was already, reading a book that's related to this one. So I hadn't actually read it before, but I'd heard a lot about it because this book was published, I think, in 2001, so it's been around for a while, but the author, Geraldine Brooks, has written a couple of novels since then, well, 3, I think, since then, and one's won the Pulitzer Prize. The People of the Book, which I think was published in 2008, won Australian Book of the Year and Literary Book of the Year in Australia as voted by publishers and booksellers here. So she's very well liked, and her books sell really, really well compared to, some other, what we call literary fiction. Just as an example, you might think that a book has done quite well in the literary fiction genre if it's sold sort of 5,000. It's like, that's pretty good. And so this book, I think, has now sold at least 150,000. So
really, that's amazing
in Australia. So she's really one of the better selling Australian/US authors. So I'd heard of her, but I hadn't read the book, and it was really interesting to read it. I think I just came away, my first reaction was, thank God I live where I live and when I live. It's quite amazingly good at bringing something to life that's actually a long time ago, and something that we might struggle. You might read all the facts about the plague, but you really struggle to comprehend what that might actually have felt like. And I think she's done a pretty good job of bringing that,
It's very
life.
Vivid, isn't it? A depiction of what happened.
Yeah, a little disgustingly vivid at some times. It sort of sent me off to research the actual disease itself. And it's not pleasant, is it, really?
We talked a little bit in the green room about the physical manifestations of the plague and the horrible things it did to people's bodies.
Yeah, like the how do you say, the buboes, those horrible growths that the people would get. And I mean, Geraldine Brooks doesn't really shy away from having her narrator, up close and personal with the actual physical ramifications of the plague and describing them in pretty blunt detail, really. So, it was disturbing.
Can I just ask, has the book done equally well outside of Australia as well?
I actually don't know what the sales figures outside of Australia are, but I know that it's sold into a lot of territories.
Right.
Because the Australian publisher has, or the agent of the novelist has sold it to a lot of different countries and into translation and what have you. So I think it's been successful outside of Australia. Yeah.
Right. So shall we talk a little bit about some of the characters in
Sure.
the novel? And the logical place, of course, is to start with Anna, the narrator.
Yeah. So as you all know, Anna is the narrator, and I guess the first thing that we sort of have to work out when you've got a first-person narrator like that is, can we trust this person?
Sure.
And it sort of becomes quite clear that she seems to be, fairly sane and telling us the truth and not trying to make us think things that aren't true. She sort of seems quite honest and straightforward. And I guess because of the structure of the book, because it opens in 1666, and then flashes back to the previous year, you get quite quickly the contrast between what she's like in what she's, the present, which is 1666, and what she had been a year before. So I felt anyway that contrast was quite well painted in how she reacted with those people around her. You saw that she was quite, bold, I guess, at the start with the way that she interacted with Elizabeth Bradford, is it, I think, the woman that comes, the richer woman. And then you sort of, when it flashes back, you see that she was sort of a bit more timid back then. So then you kind of know, okay, well, there's a journey to be had here for this character through the course of the rest of the book. And she, it's a pretty dramatic book, isn't it? Like, there's a lot that happens in there. And she herself, I think, is kind of a heightened character in that she kind of stands in for a journey that society seems to be on at that point in time, in France and in England. It was sort of the beginning of, what we call the Enlightenment. So that move from religion ruling the way we think about the world to, the birth of science, proper science and the age of reason, as they call it, and thinking, okay, no, well, what does reason tell us about things rather than just the church? And, you see Anna go on that journey herself. So in that way, I think Brooks has really sort of decided, well, this is how she's going to illustrate some of those ideas in that character herself. Yeah.
I've got a few questions about that for you. Okay. But just Anna's position in the village is particularly, it's a good one from which to tell the story, isn't it? Because she's got a view into lots of different aspects of the village.
Yeah, she's well placed. So, I think I read in the notes at the end that Brooks had read a letter from the rector of that town, Aim, that she's based the book on, where he just sort of made a comment that his wife had died, but fortunately his maid was still alive and he didn't know what he'd do without her, that kind of thing. So I think that was what set her off on thinking, oh, well, who is this character and what would she be doing? And so that was sort of, I guess, the genesis of choosing someone from, the lower classes. But because she works for the rector and then also for the big house of the town, and then also, interacts with people through developing her midwifery skills and what have you. She's in a lot of the right places at the right time to be able to tell us what's going on.
Because Mr. George Vickers, who arguably brings the plague to the village in the first place, right. He's in her house too, right?
Yeah,
so she
exactly.
can tell the whole story from the start.
Yeah, so she sees it, right there. And I think there's one point where she talks about where they work out the map of where the plague has spread in the village, and she sort of sees it as these bursts of, starbursts or something coming out from her house. And so it's like, that's a very visual way of saying she's right in the middle of it, Right. Yeah, it starts with her.
Yeah. So her transformation, there's a few different ways in the text that's affected, the ways that we can see how she changes from the beginning to the end of the story. Do you want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I guess the most obvious one, I guess, is you see that contrast between her, how she behaves around these people that at the beginning of her, earlier in her life she would have been timid around them, and then at the end she's not. And so there's a line, I think, where she says that she's coming down the stairs to talk to that Elizabeth Bradford, and she sort of says, I didn't have to fear her, I didn't have to be afraid. And there's a line where she says something about, I'd seen as much as a warrior, or 20 warriors or something like this. So she's really realising that her experience has made her into a different person. And obviously throughout the book we see these sort of times and places where she's been challenged, which I'm sure you've all, spoken about perhaps in class, but about the, she's afraid of midwifery, of being involved with the herb side of things. She talks about, people will think you're a witch if you get involved in this sort of healing type stuff. But she does it, and she goes to a birth, and she overcomes this sort of fear that she has based on her own experience of her mother dying as well. And then going down the mine with, to help out the
Which
child.
Which was terrifying, wasn't it? The whole passage where she's trapped under the stones.
Wouldn't be afraid of, especially, even today, it's a kind of a scary thing. And you think about back then when there wasn't really any safety involved at all. Plus, her husband died doing exactly what she's trying to do. And that's pretty evocative, I reckon, that scene where she's in there and sort of feeling like she can't breathe. And I was sitting there thinking, could I be this brave? I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe not. Not made of tough stuff, but I guess you had to be then, in a way. So she sort of got, tougher and tougher until in the end, I mean, God, she's taking off overseas, which is pretty full on.
And what about her relationship with the rector? How does that change from I suppose we meet her after the transformation, and then we go back into the story, and then we come out.
And then there's another transformation at the end. I found that, for me personally, that was one of the most interesting parts of it. Not even just her relationship with him, but the reader's relationship with him, which is because it's clever the way that it's written. You start off with one idea of him, which is that he's obviously lost his faith or his mind or whatever you want to call it. But then you have this idea of what he was, which is quite a calming, heroic figure that you have respect for, and you kind of think he's sort of, has morals, and he's really sticking to them, and he's at everyone's bedside when they're dying, And then I guess when they observe that, I can't remember her name now, but the woman, the girl that used to help Anna babysit, and then they sort of see her on the side of the road, Jane, I think so. And the rector kind of, she's drunk and she's having sex with this man on the side of the road, and the rector sort of says to him, to the man involved, oh, well, you've done the wrong thing, see you later, and then lets the girl have it. That's the first sort of moment for me anyway, where I went, what? Hang on a second, I don't agree with, why this unfair emphasis on what the woman's done and not what the man's done. And it seems inconsistent with how he's behaved up until that point. And then he says something about, in these times, we're all... He sort of makes it seem like, this is out of character. And so you sort of think, okay, well, maybe this is an attitude that he used to have or that he was brought up with, and he's over the course of his life done his best to overcome it, and now under pressure he's sort of snapped back. But, so you sort of... You get thrown off, but then you forgive him and you keep going, and then you kind of have this revelation of this situation that he has enforced on his wife in his marriage, of not consummating his marriage. And that's when you just sort of, I think, at the same time as Anna, you kind of go, what? Hang on a second. So she has never hinted at that in her retelling. She's told it so that you go along with her, her journey of thinking that he's this one thing, and then you find out he's this other. And I thought that was quite interestingly done, because it's almost like it reflects, like for me, I think the major journey that these characters go on is that they start off with this sort of, a belief in God and that there's some order, to be found using religion, and then she comes through to the end and that gets kind of ripped away from her, and it's almost like the author does that with this father figure he's not a god, but he's kind of, someone reassuring, seems to know what's going on. You can look up to him, you can respect him, you can look to him to see what you should do, and then suddenly you can't trust him. And it's you kind of feel a bit bereft as well, in the way that I think they do, that like, okay, I can't make sense of this anymore, If you can't rely on him, what can you rely on? So it's kind of a neat... Not a trick, but yeah. What about then the question of religion in the novel? Can we talk a little bit about the journey that takes, and the relationship between maybe the villagers and the rector, and the position of religion in the community at the beginning when the plague begins to strike, and then where we end up? Yeah, well, I think one of the things that was interesting to me was to realise... at the start you kind of think, okay, well, they're all obviously religious in that they're going to church, and they do agree to stay and keep the plague sort of confined to their town by not going anywhere. Which is huge, but very quickly you're sort of reminded that there are other factors involved. I think even in the church, when they're having a discussion about whether they're going to agree to this, effectively, you overhear Anna's stepmother saying, oh, well, at least we'll be guaranteed of food, and it's not long after that the Bradfords leave, and they sort of have that argument and say, oh, well, we have a choice, so we're going to leave, and Anna realises, oh, actually, I don't really have much of a choice. So it is there's religious, religion is part of that decision, but it's obviously not all of that decision for a lot of those people. So, so I mean, it's obviously something that they believe in at the start. But the other thing I think is interesting is that this has all come, if you look at the setting of when this is happening, Anna herself has lived through, I think she would have lived through, been very young when King Charles I was beheaded, and then Oliver Cromwell came in, and you had the English Civil War, which was, a lot of it, there was a lot to do with religion in that war, in that Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan and had very different thoughts about what religion should be. And so she's sort of grown up in a very tumultuous time. So on the one hand, you think, there's been years and years and years and centuries of religion making people think and behave in a certain way. But actually, it was quite a revolutionary
There's been a lot of turmoil, hasn't there?
Yeah. So it's not that surprising that some of these changes take place. It's not like,
And what about the relationship between religion and superstition? Because that's such a key feature in the novel.
It is,
isn't it?
And I was sort of reading it, and it's funny because right at the point where I think Anna has this sort of revelation was right when I was sort of thinking, hang on a second. So she goes to this woman's house, this couple's house, and they have a baby who is ill, and I think they've been paying for these charms from this ghost woman. And it's to do with witchcraft or superstition. And I was sort of thinking, they're all very against superstition, but really, isn't religion just, you kind of think, isn't that sort of like superstition? How do they draw that line, and why do they say this supernatural thing is correct and this one is just a load of rubbish, And then she walks out and she stubs her toe, I think, and she has this sort of epiphany where she just thinks, did God make me do that, trip over? And I think, no, he didn't. But if I'd tripped over and really hurt my head, I would have probably thought that God was responsible. So she's sort of thinking, why do I draw that line? And then she goes on to sort of obviously have this realisation that maybe the plague doesn't have anything to do with religion or superstition. And maybe it's just, something in nature that you can study. And so that's her big revelation, which obviously is what, society and doctors and humans everywhere that was the journey we went on. So she sort of has it in this lovely little moment by herself, which is, it's nicely encapsulated, I suppose.
Yeah.
But,
It's hard to imagine what that would have been like at the time, though, to not have the benefit of science to be able to explain why things were happening. Because you'd have such a lack of knowledge, and the amount of fear when coupled with not being able to understand things. So people logically thought that the women who were able to use herbs had some sort of other knowledge that was given to them by obviously malevolent forces because nobody else had access to it. To suddenly go from that journey of having everything explained neatly by God to the idea that maybe there isn't one overarching, system behind everything. It's been on the edge of a precipice, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that is really hard to take in, to put yourself in that position. It's very hard to wonder what that might be like, because for so long now we have had so much more knowledge about, we've had a few hundred years now to be wrapping our heads around it. But that's why I think she's used a few techniques like the idea of the priest to try and somehow make you feel that in your gut that, some certainty has been really taken away from you.
Do you think then Geraldine Brooks is setting up science and religion as being diametrically opposed? Is there a possibility that both can coexist in her novel, or does she say one has to be at the expense of the other?
Well, it's really interesting because if you think about what happens to Anna in terms of her relationship with Montpelier, that disintegrates and she sort of loses her faith in his religion and in him. But then, so that's sort of one father figure and reassuring person that's sort of taken away. And then she sets sail and she goes off, and she ends up pursuing this thing that she has chosen to give her life meaning. but she's doing it under another man who is religious in another country. So I think he's Muslim, or so he has multiple wives and he prays regularly, and so she says they have discussions about religion. So it feels a bit open-ended. She says she has hope but not faith, and that'll do for now. So it's kind of left a bit open-ended. And I mean, if you look at since the Enlightenment, there has been this back and forwards argument. I mean, these are huge questions. Obviously, it's I feel ridiculous even trying to address them, but it's this is what humanity has been trying to sort of figure out. Okay, well, now that we have this science, this understanding, does that immediately mean that you can't believe in God? And then you have people who are saying, well, no, because you can have a kind of God that allows all this to also be. But I just think that it wasn't necessarily the end of a belief in God. Obviously, it wasn't the end of a belief in God or of religion, but it was a big change in the parts of our lives that held sway in. So once they worked out about that it was the fleas on the rats and they understood what was actually going on, it's like religion had to make way. It could still be there, but it couldn't explain things in the same way. Yeah.
The journey that they take in the book to find that information is really interesting, though, isn't it? It's sort of very trial and error, and they're trying these different herbs and they're brewing up things in the kitchen, and then there's these little moments of epiphany, was the word you described before, what you used before, which I think is a really good way to describe it. That's when you come across information and you suddenly have a complete change of opinion about something, and a moment of realisation, and it's something very pedestrian. She stubs her toe, but it suddenly sheds light on all of this other stuff.
And she's also, I don't know, were you reading it kind of going, what of these herbs worked? Like, did that, you kind of want to know what's going on. So she's boiling stuff up. And like, there was quite I thought it was a nice moment where she's in the kitchen, and they're trying, her and Eleanor, who we haven't even mentioned yet, are trying to take over some of the work that the witches were doing, the Gaudis, after they'd died. And there's a moment where she just says, she didn't know what she was doing. So she took a herb and she'd try to treat it 3 different ways and see which way worked best. And you're like, oh, hello, science, experiment. Like she's obviously putting her reason to work on that small scale. And so is Eleanor, is really thinking about it in a very pragmatic, reasonable way, as opposed to almost everyone else in the village, it seems. Yeah.
And the experimenting with drugs thing, she took the poppy vial, right?
This book's got everything, doesn't it? She's tripping, and I thought that's a really interesting moment in her development, because that's a big decision that she makes. Like,
it's
she
about
burns,
choice, isn't
it? She chooses to not hold on to those poppies that could give her some escape from the hell around her, and instead she puts it on the fire. And I mean, there's a bit of peer pressure there going on, because she's standing there with Eleanor, who's kind of going, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will judge you if you don't.
I'm the rector's wife. So.
Yeah, exactly. So the decision she makes is, I'm going to throw this stuff on the fire, and I'm not going to have that as an option. And I think she makes it because she thinks, well, she remembers, doesn't she, that her work is, they've been working all day on these herbs and stuff, and she's realised that that's really taken her mind off the horrors around her, and she's sort of realised that both of those, you've got the poppies on the one hand, and you've got work on the other, and she's like, well, both of them kind of take me out of this situation and make me feel better. It's just that one of them means that I'm useful to other people as well, so she goes with that.
It's a great illustration of the options that she does have open to her, didn't she? And that's basically what I think makes Anna the central character throughout. She's the one who's by the end of the story, she's making active choices, when so much of the other drama in the story comes from things that are foisted upon the villagers. They can't do anything about the plague coming. The rector makes the choice that they should stay, and they don't really have a choice whether to abide by that or not. So they're very helpless in a lot of ways. And one of the things that comes out of Anna's character is that she actively makes choices instead of being passive. Yeah,
she gets in there and she literally gets her hands dirty, and gets on with helping out rather than despairing, and so she's obviously made of
strong
tough stuff. But one thing I did want to say, because I actually, I've looked at some of the notes and what people have said about this book, and I was really surprised that the question of money is not mentioned at the end, where she, the reason that she can be as bold and brave and everything as she is that she gets a whole lot of money from the Bradfords. So yes, she makes a decision, but it was only a decision that was open to her because they were willing to pay her off and go, so yeah, she's bold, but was she happened to observe this what happened with the Bradfords, where the Elizabeth Bradford was trying to drown this child, and so she makes this good decision of fighting her about that, and of being willing to take this child. So they're all things she decides, but it's kind of she does things that none of the others do, but she's in a special position to be able to.
That's a really interesting point, because throughout the novel we're led to be quite critical of the Bradfords and the choice they make not to stand and fight, and they use their wealth and advantage to get out of the village. She kind of does the same thing, doesn't she?
In the end, yeah, she does it for possibly a better reason, and she's put the time in to stay there, at the start. But I just thought it was interesting. It's kind of you look at her character and the time that it was, and I don't know if other people were doing this, but I was constantly looking up words where I was like, what is that word? And one of them, which I wish I hadn't, was, now I can't even remember it, but it was basically the scold's bridle, this thing that they would put on women as punishment for talking too much or being scolding or what have you. Anna remembers her mum being in one of those, and then there's something as well about the stocks, obviously, and the I can't remember, it was some chair that women would get sat in, tied into, and then held up to embarrass them or what have you. So there's all this sort of stuff going on, and now I've lost my train of thought. But she does.
Just while you remember, when I was a kid, my parents took me to Inverary Jail, which is like a 15th century jail in the northeast of Scotland that's now a museum. And I remember seeing those scolds, and they're real, because there was a lot of witch trials in Scotland.
On Wikipedia.
They're horrible.
Yeah.
These big, it's really creepy.
Yes. I actually can't remember where I was going with that. Maybe I'll remember later on. But yeah, I guess I was just sort of thinking she is bold, and she, makes a lot of choices that are different to people around her, but she also has some opportunities that maybe other people don't.
Others don't. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're about ready to open up to you guys if you have questions. There'll be mics coming down the back. So, does anyone have a question right now? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Can we just talk a little bit about the differences between the way the male and the female characters are drawn in the novel?
Yeah.
There's not an awful lot of positive role models by the end of the story in the male camp, are there?
Are there any? I mean, there's parts of the of Montpelier that you respect, or you can feel for him. And I guess the dad, as horrendous as he is, Josiah. There's also, towards the end, there's a bit of a nod to some of the horrendous things that he went through as a child that kind of helped to explain why he might be so horrid. And I guess there's Brand, the young guy who, although he does do
some sort of error along the way as well, doesn't he?
Well, because he is one of the two that they put... Afra, is that how you say her? The stepmother, when they're holding her prisoner overnight ahead of her trial, they put her in the. That was a horrific scene. So he's not. None of them are completely wonderful, but there's not a lot. I mean, compared to the women characters, who are, there's a lot more to admire about them. I think that's what I was actually going to say before, is that you can read about these characters and I mean, this is fiction, so you're allowed to do that, and you're allowed to use these women to bring up these themes, but sometimes you're kind of like, really, was there someone like this really then? It's a bit, anachronistic sometimes. Who are you
thinking of specifically?
Well, I'm thinking of Agnes, I don't know how we're going to say her name, but when she says, I'm free and I wouldn't give up my liberty for anything. And I'd love to think that there were women in 1665 who were thinking that and being like that. And perhaps there were, and that's great. But it did kind of feel a bit like someone from now has been dropped back into a...
Would they have articulated it in the same way?
Well, would they have said it like that?
Yeah.
Probably not. Or, they might have groped towards some understanding of that, but would they have really been that liberated? And and I think with Anna as well, you kind of, like I said earlier, I think she stands in for this journey that society as a whole was on, but whether one woman in that time would actually have been able to go that far, I don't know. Yeah.
And she put up with a lot, didn't she? She withstood an awful lot of trials.
She did. And I noticed that we're back on the women again. We sort of went, let's talk about the men, and then we went, oh, no. But, I'm trying to think what other men there were, but certainly not as rounded, I guess, apart from Michael Montpelier as the women characters. Yeah, I think we're supposed to like them better.
Yeah.
I've got two questions. One, do you think that this is a feminine text? And also, going on from that, what are your ideas on the relationship between Eleanor and Anna?
Me? Yeah. Well, I think it's feminine in that it's showing that this woman should be and can be equal to the men. I mean, she's actually kind of in this situation, she's better than the men around her at a lot of stuff. So, I mean... Yeah, I think it's championing women. So I'd say that's feminist, yeah. And the relationship between the women, I think that's another place where that lies, in that you're seeing what the two of them together through a relationship that has mutual respect, what they can actually achieve. I mean, it never goes into the details of whether their work really does anything, like in terms of the herbs. Like the plague ends, but you don't really know why that is. Quite possibly it's because of the big bonfire that they have and get rid of everything that was infected. But I think it's trying to illustrate that that those relationships between women have for a long, long time been something that has been really positive in the world. That's my reaction to it anyway.
I think there's one down on this left-hand side.
I don't really have so much as a question, but to ask you about what is your feeling about the ending of the book?
Yeah, we were just talking about this, weren't we? Jenny was saying that she sort of thought it came a bit out of the blue, and I did,
I felt it was a little extreme. I thought that she, at that time, you could have left the village and left the region, but stayed within England and still had enough distance from what happened. So for me, it felt like maybe an unnecessary step, and so it jarred a little bit with the rest of my reading of the novel, I think, because we'd spent all of our time in such a small world to suddenly go off over the seas, and it felt a little rushed to me. The wet nurse comes with her and then she packs her off again, and I thought,
the last act's kind of all squashed in. Yeah. But we were also saying that so Camus' The Plague is set in Oran, which is the town that she ends up in. So whether that, I assume, that's obviously done consciously on the part of Geraldine Brooks, and so whether she's sort of said, I'm going to have her go there just to sort of pay homage to the fact that this important book was set there. And actually, I don't know if I said this, but so I was reading that book when I was asked to do this, and I got to the end of the Camus book, and it said, the last paragraph is sort of saying, of course, plague can stay in places, in cupboards, infecting this or that for many, many years. And I'm like, oh my God, because she brings the jerkin or whatever it's called, her thing that she made for her son. I'm like, could it have lasted 300 years? And, is that the beginning of... Anyway, that was my little thing. But yeah, so the ending, I liked that she ended up making meaning of her experience by pursuing science and, or trying to understand the world in a reasonable way, separate to just religion. And I thought that was an interesting way of doing that, whilst also being a bit you know, she's still has to live under a man's control, really. You know, so it wasn't just all happy. There was a bit of tension there, yeah.
What did you think, the lady that asked the question?
I thought the ending didn't really gel with my reading of the rest of the novel. It was just, as my friend here said, a little bit Walt Disney, in that it all seemed to be tied up in a pretty big bow.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. But I guess I could kind of, knowing that it was maybe because of this other book as well, I was sort of like, oh, okay, maybe that's part of the reason why, and it explains it just a little bit. But yeah, I had a similar reaction. Yeah.
We have another question or a comment? If somebody wants to tell us what their experience of reading the book was. Come on, somebody.
Did people? Yeah.
This one didn't front. I'll just wait on the mic there, sorry.
Could you comment on the title and the little quote at the beginning of the book, please?
Yeah.
I've still to come to terms with the title, because I don't think it really expresses what the book is about.
Yeah, well, I was sort of pondering this, and I thought, oh, I'll read that full poem, you know, see if that explains it. So by Dryden, I think it is. It's really long. So I didn't get the chance to read the whole thing. I looked it up on the internet, which is tragic. I should have been, you know, but it, you know, when the scroll is sort of here and you're trying to move it down, you're expecting and it was just staying up there. I'm like, okay, this is a really long poem. So I had the same reaction. I was sort of like, really, Year of Wonders, like what? But there's a point in the book where she, sort of the last happy afternoon or moment that Anna has, where she's at the river with her children, and the Montpellier comes along and he's reading from a book, and he says that it's about miracles and how people, I can't remember who it was that had written this. It's a real life person that had written this book he was reading, a monk from years ago or something, and saying, describing very normal things, so things growing, things, you know, life coming back after winter, that sort of thing. And the writer was saying that, imagine if you took someone who'd never seen that stuff before and put them somewhere and showed it to them, they would call that a miracle. They would call it a wonder, you know. And so for me it was kind of a comment saying, you know, basically, yeah, there's all this horrible stuff that's happened, but when you look at the year after the plague, you know, you see that walnut that's growing up in the street and all those things, they become wonders after so much tragedy, you know, just the everyday normal things. The fact that life keeps going on is wonderful. And one of my favourite moments in the book is when she goes for a horse ride, you know, that bit where she just goes, we're alive, like, let's go and run, you know. That was quite moving for me. It's just like, we might not be able to understand why, but somewhere in most humans is this desire to keep living even when everything can be fairly terrible.
For me as well, I think it related as well to that sort of revelation that there might be answers other than religion to explain why things happen and where things come from, and that sort of transformation of Anna's to a different type of understanding of the world, and a different
she's
realisation.
Sort of starting to border a little on like existentialism, really, like, and you know, which Camus was obviously, well, his is absurdism, but you know, this idea of how, you know, that we make meaning, that's what humans want to do, but sometimes the world doesn't help us do that. Sometimes the world doesn't make any sense at all, and so there's this tension between what we want to do, what our natural desire is, and what we're up against in trying to do that. And I think she is kind of on that road towards, trying to puzzle that out, and whether religion is involved and whether God is involved, and Who's your favourite character?
For a long time it was Montpellier. And even though the way he turned out at the end, I still, because I was really interested in in the beginning, I wondered whether he was one of these characters that you quite often find in literature, and you probably found in life, who were people who were in the church mostly because of a kind of social conscience, and they wanted to work closely with people, and they wanted to be kind of community architects in a way. And whether his faith, I was interested in the kind of social progressiveness of that and how he helped the villagers' lives, and the decision he made to have everybody stay in the village village, I felt, was far more based in science and somehow a deep understanding that it could only be contained by the people staying in the one place and toughing it out, really. That decision to me seemed to be made more on the basis of science than on religion. And so, I don't know, as we kind of got to know him better, then it seemed actually that no, maybe he was religious all along, and it was that had driven him somehow repenting to God or whatever. I was quite confused, and the revelation at the end about how he treated Eleanor and how that relationship went, I'd lost respect for him, but at the same time it made sense to me in a way in the context of the other things that were happening in his life. So I found him really interesting and complex, and even though great heroine Anna at the end of it, I found him to be quite intriguing, and I think I've thought about him since leaving the novel just as much as I've thought about her.
And it's funny when you say it was more to do with science. I mean, it was also, did he have to, as he sort of seemed to find out at the end, did he have to believe in God to believe in some of the things that because when he makes the argument about whether you would go or stay during the plague, he says, someone, I think Bradford says to him, oh, well, if there was a tiger chasing you, would you stand still or would you run away? And he says, well, I wouldn't run away if running away meant that it was leading this tiger to these other people. And it's like, well, God, I mean, these are huge questions again. Like, where does your morality, does it have to be just, grounded in understanding that there's a God, or is there some kind of moral that we have just because we live in a community and we have these feelings for each other? And so he holds a lot of those ideas there in that character. And
there's a few circles, isn't there? Because is he responsible just for him and his family, or for the village, or for society as a whole? And you can argue the toss at all different levels. Different people in the novel make different choices on those different questions.
And I don't understand why he thinks that he's failed or done such a terrible thing in asking them to stay, because would he have felt great if they'd spread the plague everywhere?
Right.
I'm with you. He was very conflicted and confusing, but interesting.
The decision to take the worshipping out of the church and into the fields, partly it was based on, or it felt to me partly it was based on not being able to recognise who was missing. But also the villagers stayed far away from each other because by this point they had figured out the contagion issues, and so there was a theme of science running through his understanding.
And the burning as well, which was both things. Like, he did it as a service and sort of offered up prayers with it, but they were also saying, oh, we'll burn these things because they have plague seed in them. So they didn't know exactly where the plague was coming from yet. I don't think they worked that out for another couple of 100 years. But they had some idea that it was in things, that that it would be there.
Also, the plague year was 1666, and then the Great Fire of London was 1667, and that was one of the key...
I thought it was in the same year. Well, anyway,
but wasn't it immediately after? So it was responsible for...
helped them out.
Oh, right.
They were starting to put things together, being scientists.
Great. Well, I guess we better leave it there. It's a couple of minutes after 15:15. So thank you very much, Matthia. Great. Thank you for coming.